Welcome to episode 4, The Issues. I'm your host, Mick Larson, producer and director of the documentary series, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day? As your host, I'll be introducing you to the authors, professors, journalists, and theologians that contributed to this series. Episode 4 looks at the issues that separate liberal and conservative Christians. So let's get started. The first voice you'll hear is that of Samuel Abrams. He's a professor of politics at Sarah Lawrence University. He's also the co-author of the book entitled Culture War: Myth of a Polarized America.
So one of the weird things that we've discovered over the past 20 years is this idea of sorting. The idea that years ago during Reagan, you could be a Reagan supporter, support certain conservative issues, but very comfortably say you're a Democrat, and it could go in the other direction as well. What's happened in the last 20 years or so with the parties is that we've shifted from saying, I'm a Republican, I believe in these general values, but I can move around, to a worldview where if someone says to me they're a Republican, I can almost perfectly predict how they're going to review things. Same thing if you're a Democrat. They've lined up. So you have certain issues, whether it's gay rights, gun control, environment, and if you are a Democrat, I can tell you, what you're going to believe. Same thing on the other side if you're a Republican.
Up next is Andrew Hartman. He's a professor of history at Illinois State University and the author of the book, A War for Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars.
Somebody might have ended up a conservative Republican because of abortion, but they're in that milieu, and so they take on a whole host of other issues. Somebody might have ended up a liberal Democrat because they believe in the rights of workers to collectively bargain, but they're in that milieu and they take on a whole host of other political meanings. And so there's been this great polarization. Recently, some sociologists have discovered that a great number of people are quitting their churches because they associate religion with conservative politics. And on the same side, a number of people have joined religions because they associate religion with conservative politics. And so our politics are driving our religious choices, and our religion is driving our political choices, and people are incredibly polarized. And it's hard to sort of untangle the religion and politics from this. We've been polarized. We had a civil war. 600,000 Americans killed each other. We've been polarized. But we've also had moments in our history where we were much less polarized. The period between the early 1930s through the late 1960s, or maybe through the mid-1960s, I would argue Americans were less polarized. And I would argue that in part this is because we were collectively responding to international crises. The Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the early Cold War, when there seemed to be this existential threat or series of threats to the nation. It's also true that at this time period, immigration was almost entirely restricted, so that was not a source of division. It's also true during this time period that once we got through the Great Depression, the economy was strong and stable, and there was a solid middle class. And so there are these factors that are leading to greater consensus during this time period that start to fall away by the 1960s. But I think that, yes, we're more polarized now, and our media choices, our media possibilities exacerbate that. Maybe media has sort of fallen in, has served a market, has recognized that we're divided, and so has served a market, and then it's a vicious cycle, exacerbates the problem of polarization.
Next, we hear from Magumbai Jue. He's a faculty of law assistant professor at McGill University and author of Exceptional America: What Divides America from the World and from Each Other.
What I suggest in my research is that if we look at the types of issues that people are clashing about, it's a much wider range of issues than in other Western democracies, because there liberals and conservatives tend to generally agree on climate change, on universal health care, on abortion, on gun control, on many issues that here are explosive issues and seemingly intractable ones.
Next, we hear from Jimmy Itzak, the former director of church life at Second Presbyterian Church in Kansas City, Missouri.
There is still this death grip that I believe Christians have on believing that they are somehow entitled to decide the direction of a nation politically. And every social issue that seems to come up seems to be a direct attack on conservative, evangelical, or just Christian worldview. And the problem is we as a nation are moving into this place where we allow, as we always really have, we allow people to have their beliefs, and those are protected, and don't hurt anybody, don't threaten anyone else's. And yet there's still this mission that politics is the tool by which we are going to help the world be like it needs to be.
Up next is Rob Briersee. He's the political organizer for the evangelical organization Vote Common Good and author of the book Running for Our Lives, a story of faith, politics, and the common good.
Yeah, gay marriage is a super interesting issue to me because it's an issue where public opinion shifted so quickly. There was leadership in both parties opposing same-sex marriage and marriage equality. And then in a short order, a drastic shift. And that actually gives me a lot of hope because I think there's a lot of people that recognize that, man, some of these issues seem like people are hard and fast and dug in. Public opinion can shift. And I think marriage equality is a really good example of that. Now, granted, there's always going to be those who do dig in and won't change, and that's a shame. But I think especially for younger evangelical Christians, a number of issues from the environment to immigration to gay marriage, as younger evangelicals get older, I think you're going to see a shift in the mood of evangelicals on those issues because they don't think the same way their parents did or their grandparents did about them.
All right, we're back with Magumbai Jue.
Same-sex marriage not only calls into question discrimination against gay people, it also calls into question patriarchy because one of the driving factors behind homophobia is that it calls into question traditional gender roles. The notion that society should follow a model where the man is the head of the household and women are subservient. And once you start calling into question traditional gender roles, which is what homosexuality does, then you also are starting to topple patriarchy. And the people who tend to be the most hostile to same-sex marriage also tend to be extremely hostile to a woman's right to choose whether she should have an abortion, also to women's access to contraception, and to equality for women in general.
Next up is some cowboy attitude with Justin McKee. He's the pastor at Lenapaw Cowboy Church in Lenapaw, Oklahoma.
Can a Christian vote for a politician that is pro-gay marriage? Absolutely. He didn't have anything against homosexuals. I mean, he didn't have anything. He didn't say anything bad about anybody. It's like, hey, let's just get right with God. Let's just make sure that He is who you're focused on all day, every day, and not your own selfish desires.
Up next is Leslie Smith. She is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Chair of the Women's and Gender Studies Department at Avila College in Kansas City, Missouri. She's also the author of Righteous Rhetoric: Sex, Speech, and the Politics of Concerned Women for America.
Even though we don't see Jesus talking in the Bible about homosexuality, even though the Bible doesn't really talk about homosexuality except in a few, momentary instances, that doesn't mean that topic is not meaningful to a particular group that needs to use religion to suit its particular political purposes at a given moment.
We are back with Magumbai.
Many countries have same-sex marriage. This has not led to any significant social problems. Rather, it's improved equality, and it's part of the evolution of democracy to be more and more inclusive, even though there has been a resistance to it. And I think that it's important to understand that gay rights are human rights.
Okay, we're back with political organizer Rob Briersee.
I believe that everyone is the child of God, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, and that everyone is valuable and deserves love and acceptance and life. Jesus just didn't reject people. He just didn't. Jesus didn't put people out, force them onto the streets.
Next, we're back with Jimmy Itzak.
Now, I grew up in a single-issue voter home, and they were Republican, and we voted on a single issue. If abortion was on the docket, then we knew which way we were going to vote, and so it was always Republican, because it was the only platform that said no. And regardless of where you stand on that, since the late 70s, abortion rates have gone down consistently, dramatically over the Obama administration for other reasons than just the legality of abortion. And yet, when we talk about these other social issues, how the poor are treated, Medicare, how veterans are treated, how farmers are, we talk about all of these different groups. It's like, it's insignificant, their journey, their plight.
Back again with Rob Briersee.
If you're pro-life, don't you have to care about people's health care? Don't you have to care about how people live this life that they have? How can you be pro-life and be in favor of children being separated from their parents at the border? How can you be pro-life and support the death penalty? When there's proven that so many people that are on death row in the United States are actually innocent.
Next up is racial justice educator and activist Debbie Irving. She's also the author of Waking Up White, Finding Myself in the Story of Race.
When I think about pro-life, I will go on the record saying that I personally would not ever choose to have an abortion. And yet I also wouldn't impose that through any kind of political. I think it is a personal decision. So when I think about people who are willing to take one piece of a politician's platform, pro-life, and center so heavily on that they're willing to just not even look at or consider the entire constellation, that tells me that belief to them is so deeply tied to their identity, their sense of self. Maybe in religion it's attached to an idea of this means I will or won't go to heaven. I mean, religion is huge because it's not just, in many religions, it's not just about this world, it's about the afterlife.
Back again with Rob Briersee.
When you look at how the abortion issue has been framed, it's been framed essentially where there's two options. You're pro-life or you're pro-choice. And I think that duality, that binary approach to that issue has actually done a lot of harm because it's forced people out of nuance into these hard and fast camps. And I'm a person that doesn't fit in those camps. I, in no way, would want to restrict or limit a woman's bodily autonomy. At the same time, I'm also the kind of person that wants to see there be as few abortions as necessary. And so I think for people that are pro-life, I would love for them to see that like there's more than one track, there's more than one option of being pro-life. It's not just I'm pro-life and that means Roe v. Wade has to be overturned. And I'm pro-life and that means strict constructionists need to be appointed to the Supreme Court so there's just that one thing. There are other ways to be pro-life. So I'm pro-life, and I think that criminalization isn't the best way to reduce the number of abortions. So when you look at like the abortion issue, is the question its legality, or is the question how many abortions are happening? And I think how many abortions are happening is the issue, not the legality. And so as a pro-life person, what I want to see is there be as few abortions as possible. So what's the best path to get there? It's not criminalization. Because right now, there's actually fewer abortions are taking place now than there were before Roe v. Wade was made legal. If you want to significantly reduce the number of abortions because you're pro-life, you're motivated by this, then Medicare for all, having a social safety net, making sure that we're fighting poverty and expanding programs that help people in need, handing out condoms, like sex education in schools, all of these things like that Christians vehemently oppose would actually make a difference in the issue that Christians say they care about. So I think what we need is an approach to this issue, like most issues, that recognizes that there's nuance. And so now I can be a pro-life person who says, well, wait a minute, I actually could vote for someone who's pro-choice because that person is going to expand healthcare and is going to expand the social safety net and doesn't oppose sex education in schools. And so even though they're pro-choice and I'm pro-life, they're actually going to enact policies that are going to bring abortion rates down, and I'm good with that. That's the ultimate goal. I'm going to vote for that person who's pro-choice.
We're back again with Mugambi Jue.
Yes, so there are many dimensions of American history that have contributed to these clashes. One of them is race. So America has historically been the Western democracy with by far the highest proportion of racial and ethnic minorities. And that's led to more division in America than in other Western nations. So for example, many of the people who oppose universal health care or public assistance programs tend to believe that these are primarily handouts to minorities on welfare, especially African Americans. And these sorts of racial divisions have really inhibited economic solidarity in the US. Whereas in Western European countries, because historically they were much more homogeneous, people, when they thought of creating programs like universal health care, they thought about something for them, for their people. They didn't think about that as primarily for immigrants or for people of color. And in the US, the racial history, these racial divisions go way back in time, and they've had a much bigger influence in shaping polarization.
Next up is Charles Tabor. He's a retired professor of political science. He's also the co-author of the book, The Rationalizing Voter.
Well, even in my own discipline, political science, in the 1980s, 1990s, a movement came up that said that, we were past racism. Race was no longer a significant force in American politics. To the extent that people opposed issues like affirmative action or welfare or other race-related issues, they did so out of principle. They were opposed to quotas. They were in favor of individualism and people, working and proving their value by hard work. These were all principled responses. So that was the claim. But of course, they weren't, right? In fact, those were symbolic factors that just hid the underlying negative response to African Americans. And I did a project in the 1990s where I examined that and found old-fashioned racism, the beliefs that African Americans are lazy, that African Americans, are less intelligent. These sort of basic beliefs from the 1940s and 50s are still alive and well across this country.
Okay, we're back with racial justice activist Debbie Irving.
If I believe that, I'm very likely also invested in it in a way that fuels my sense of self and my identity. So to challenge that isn't just to challenge an idea, it's to challenge an identity, a set of emotions. It's a major project to challenge a belief system or even a part of a belief system.
And we're back with Magumbai.
Many of the people who opposed Obama's healthcare reform believed that its main recipients would be black people on welfare, even though most, or at least a huge share of the beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act were white and employed. It's not only beneficial for the poorest of the poor. Universal health care is something that is beneficial for the vast majority of society.
Next up is retired Professor Charles Tabor.
So that's why they labeled it Obamacare. That really, nails home the narrative. Again, but it does it covertly. Okay, that's what's clever about it, because you're not saying it's black care, you're not saying it's African American care. You're saying it's Obamacare, and you're letting it's a subtle way to do it. And unconscious processes are always most powerful when they're covert. So some of those things that we were talking about, like gay rights, that's a threat. Like healthcare, universal healthcare. This is perceived by many people as a threat. And why would that be? Why would healthcare be seen as a threat? I think it's really because of again, it's an ideological interpretation, but an interpretation that people are being told what to do. They've lost personal control. Okay, so it is absolutely, in my view, a benefit, objectively, to have health care available. But if what we're doing is we're telling you, you must get health care, and you must get health care of this particular type, or you have to get it in this particular way, people will react to that negatively. So it's seen as a threat to personal freedom. And coming back to race, but I don't think we can forget that it was an African American president that did this, and so that again raises racism as a subtext to the whole debate.
Next, we have journalist and columnist Ellis Cose. He's the author of the book "The Rage of the Privileged Class."
The racial legacy of America is to understate the complexity of what we're dealing with. I think because we are a very individualistic country, because we believe people make their own fate, because we believe that anyone can rise up by their own bootstraps, because we believe that there are good people and bad people and the good people always win, because we believe these kinds of things, we put a huge amount of emphasis on individual activities and individual acts and individual feelings, and so racism to many people is not what is called systemic racism, which is, why are certain people in neighborhoods, why are certain people have jobs, why do certain people not have educations, which have very little to do with whether you feel animosity as an individual toward African Americans. But what we tend to do is to think, well, if I don't feel any animosity towards this group of people, then there's no racism, there's no problem. And because it becomes between you and me. If you as a person don't hate me, and then what right do I have to complain about racism to you? And there's a certain truth to that, in terms of interpersonal relations, sure. And I think it's laudable that as a country, we've become a country where it's much easier to see beyond race to a certain extent, and to just relate to people because they're interesting or bright, or because they share a common set of concerns that you have. And there's a huge but. We have built this country on a foundation of racism. We have built this country on a foundation of slavery. That foundation is still there, and that foundation affects what we have erected, above that. And trying to deal with that is much more difficult, because what that means is, okay, even if you as an individual don't hate black people, don't you have a responsibility to figure out how come people in one neighborhood are getting a good education and people in another neighborhood are not? And even if you are not personally racist, don't we as a society have some kind of obligation to try to ensure that people actually do have something at least remotely relating to equality of opportunity if they put in the equal amount of effort, and if they have aspirations, that they have at least the possibility of achieving that. So that becomes a question much harder to deal with in every way than the question of, do I as an individual hate Mexicans, or do I as an individual hate Arabs, or do I as an individual hate black people?
Up next is Reverend Gayla Rapp. She's a retired pastor in the United Methodist Church.
What's happening right now with race and the terrible things happening around the treatment of African Americans in our country, clearly we are a country that has not dealt with the deep-seated racism. Racism just embedded in our very being in this country. And we need to confront that sin in ourselves. And we're going to find people who find that political, or people who may disagree. I'm okay with that. We need to be in conversation, though, because it's a brokenness that will only be healed until we start to get real and get honest with each other about it.
And we're back with Assistant Professor Magumbai Jue.
In some ways, this is a problem that's always existed. All human beings across the left, right, in the US and other countries tend to have a bias towards certain kinds of information and only hear what they want to hear. But the difference is that in the US, in the last few decades, there's been the normalization of disinformation, which is a deliberate spread of false information. That's on a much wider scale than in other periods of American history and compared to other Western democracies. So the routine claims about climate change being a hoax, which are widespread among the Republican establishment, are commonly aired on stations like Fox News or other hardline conservative media. These are very peculiar by other countries' standards. In Europe, conservatives tend to accept climate change, and the media does not promote the notion that it's a hoax. So I would say that this is something very peculiar to much of American society. It's not even about conservatism per se, it's about a peculiar conception of conservatism that's emerged in recent decades.
Next, we hear from Dr. Alan Francis, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, School of Medicine, Duke University. He's the author of The Twilight of American Sanity.
Thomas Jefferson said that you can't have a democracy without a free press. Donald Trump understands that. And what he has done quite successfully in the minds of a substantial 35–40% of the public is to instill the idea that they should believe this man who lies 20 times a day and has been lying his whole life, that they should believe this con man, this snake oil salesman, this serial bankrupt, this serial sexual molester, that they should believe him and his Fox News sycophants rather than the free press of America. This is a very dangerous moment in American democracy. The only guards we have to our fragile civil rights are a free press, free and fair courts, and the public, we the people.
And we're back with history professor Andrew Hartman.
What I think has become more apparent since the 1960s than at any time in American history, save perhaps for the Civil War period, is that there are these deep divisions in how Americans conceptualize reality. And we look at things through these particular lenses.
And we're back with Magumbai.
For instance, universal health care is widely accepted throughout the West, and people realize that it's much more cost-effective and provides health care to everyone. And here, many people believe that the U.S. Healthcare system is much less expensive than those of other countries who suffer under the tyranny of socialized medicine. So because there's no common consensus on basic facts, it's very difficult to find a common ground for policy reforms. Another example is gun control. Some people believe that the more guns society has, the safer it is, whereas actually it's the exact opposite.
Next up is photojournalist and documentary producer Anthony Sewell. He's also the author of Fear This.
So you don't know what is real and what is not. All you've got to do is create a seed of doubt within the fact, one small seed. And once you create doubt, then you can disable the truth. And that's exactly how I think they have used the media in a way to and the internet is very good at that because it's easy to do. You can reach a lot of people, you can create websites, you can create sites that tell people what they want to hear.
Next is Paula Ioannidis, Associate Professor, Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity at Ithaca College in New York. She's also author of The Emotional Politics of Racism: How Feelings Trump Facts in an Era of Colorblindness.
Again, with Donald Trump, you see he's masterful at manipulating mass emotion. And then the facts absolutely don't matter. No matter how many times we repeat them, there's this whole faction of people who just believe that people on welfare are, undeserving, or that immigrants are stealing our resources. So we keep saying to them, but no, let me show you how immigrants are actually contributing to the economic, pot, and it doesn't matter what we tell them. But there is this question that kind of emerges in this political moment, which is, can you actually talk to people who are completely unreceptive to actual reality? I mean, whose sense of reality is so warped because it's kind of bought into this repetitive sort of narrative discourse that has been put on long before Trump. I mean, Trump simply took it to the highest office, but this has been building for 40 years, if you really chart its history.
Okay, our last voice in this episode is history professor Andrew Hartman.
So many Americans believe that the increasing number of horrible hurricanes are God's wrath. Well then, what are we going to do about global warming if so many Americans believe that? It's a problem because the most powerful political party in the world is really the only political party in the world that denies that humans have changed the climate and have warmed the climate. If some minor party in, Portugal believed that, well then it wouldn't really make a difference. But the most powerful party in the whole world firmly rejects the science of climate change. And it's because so many of the people who vote in this party believe that God sends hurricanes to punish people.
Thanks for listening to episode number 4. A lot of perspective on the differences between liberal and conservative Christians. I hope you'll join me for episode 5, The Answer. We hear the answer to the documentary's question, would the love and grace of Jesus align itself better with Democrats or Republicans? Don't forget, you can watch the documentary series for free online at www.jd.vote. That's whatwouldsjesusdo.vote. Thanks and take care.